Okay, so we kind of touched on this already, but let's go into informed consent and debriefing a little more, as well as deception. So consent is, of course, a legal term. Um, it can only be given by adults. Minors give assent, but they can't give consent. So because they're not cognitively capable yet. So that's why, again, with children, you have to take extra steps, and they have to usually both them and their parent or guardian has to give consent. So a few things when it comes to consent. Um, you'll give like a piece of paper people will sign, like I mentioned before, and it should be written. I'll show you an example in just a minute. It should be written in plain English, so no jargon, and it should give the purpose of the study. Usually, you'll explain why they've been chosen to participate as well, if if that's applicable. A few other things you cover in your consent form. Describe the procedures to be used. Now, again, you're not going to tell them everything about the study, like exactly what the manipulation might be, but you are going to tell them what they need to do. Okay, so you can't tell them, okay, this study is going to be about, um, I don't know, driving and cell phones, and you're going to do a driving simulator, and then no, it's actually about memory tests. So you obviously can't do that. Um, but you will give them a generally what they're going to do. So you're going to study a list of words and try to remember them. You're going to do X, Y, and Z. You'll include how long it will take, because they need to know that, and again, what they will do. Um, it is important to include anything that might affect their willingness to participate. So if there is something that could conceivably cause discomfort or stress, you have to make sure that's clear up front. Okay. So yeah, if you're gonna if it's a scenario that might make them uncomfortable or stress them out, you obviously need to make that clear up front. They need to know about that going in. Same with sensitive topics. So if you're going to ask them about something that um, they might not want to share, that's also something you need to be clear about up front and in your consent form. And then lastly, you're going to include the worst. So whatever kind of the most um, potentially stressful or discomforting part of your study is, that's something that needs to be in the consent form. Your consent form is also going to describe the foreseeable risks. So whatever in the study could make them uncomfortable, could make them stressed out, or even cause pain or whatever, or mental anguish. You have to describe those foreseeable risks. And it's important to note that you can't always foresee risk, so that's why we see foreseeable risk here, right? I mean, someone could have an aneurysm doing a memory test, but that's not really foreseeable. So you would just say you're going to do a memory test if you participate. You also describe the benefits to the participant and the population where you got them from, as well as to science. So why is the study important? You're also going to include confidentiality information. So um, you're gonna tell them in the consent form, here's what we're going to do with your data. It will or won't be linked to your name. It'll be anonymous if it is. Whatever your plan is there. That's something that should also be in the consent form. And then information about incentives. So what are they getting for doing the study, if anything? And then also a name of a contact person. So you'll often have at the bottom there, if you have any questions, please contact. And then that will be the principal investigator, the person with a PhD who's in charge of the study. Um, here's what this looks like. Um, you could just pause the video and read that on your own. and then when you're done, just resume the video. The other thing that your research has to go through, and your consent form will go through as well before you can start actually running the study, is the Institutional Review Board. So I think every university has one, and this is going to be, they're going to be in charge of the ethics of all the research, and they're of course going to evaluate your study and decide, okay, is this ethical? Right? Now, again, kind of like I touched on before, if your study is very low risk, like you're just something like a memory test, it doesn't go through the same amount of review. Whereas if you're doing something that is potentially harmful, well, then it goes through more extensive review, and you have to provide pretty a pretty compelling argument that um, there's no other way to do it. Um, there's no other way to do it. It's also worth the risk. Right? Another important thing here is that people on the IRB are individuals with no vested interest in the research. So they're not people who are part of your study, because obviously that would be a conflict of interest if they wanted to get the study up and running, and they're also on the review board. So it has to be people who are not don't care about your study, so to speak. There's actually a few different levels. So kind of like I mentioned, when they read your proposal, um, and again, this all happens before the research is allowed to even get started. They assess the risk and benefit. So if it's exempt, that means there's no risk involved. It's like, say, analyzing existing data, or you know already collected data or something along those lines. No risk involved. Then it would be exempt. On the other hand, it might be, if it's pretty low risk, then it's going to be expedited, meaning they will evaluate the study, but it's not as thoroughly reviewed as something that is more risky. And then lastly, you have full. So if something is pretty risky, meaning it could cause people distress or harm or something, then it goes through a full review. So they look for the following criteria when it comes to approval. Um, Kind of like we touched on, risks should be minimized. So again, they're not gonna let it pass if there's any risks that are unnecessary, right? If they're not, the risks have to be kept as minimal as possible. Risks should be just so, like, if your data can be easily kept anonymous or not linked to a name, then they're going to expect that. If it's impossible to keep your data anonymous, like it's being recorded or it's an interview, well, then you're still minimizing it, but it's the best you can do. Risks, of course, have to be justified by the benefits. So, whatever you're doing, especially if it is risky, is it going to be an important finding? Selection of the participants is fair, so you're not just singling out certain group of people or anything like that. Anyone who wants to can participate. Um, they'll also, of course, check that informed consent is there. So they'll look through your consent form and decide if that's okay or not, and if it gives all the necessary information. That it's going to be safely monitored, and there'll also be reporting. So, you know, if there are potential risks, do you have a plan in place for how you're going to keep track of those, and if need be, discontinue the study? Kind of like we mentioned, privacy and confidentiality, how you're going to protect those, if you can protect them. And then also, lastly, vulnerable groups. Vulnerable groups are protected, so like children, prisoners, those with Alzheimer's or something like that. Okay. One of the last things we want to touch on is deception. So deception is when you actually lie to your participants. Um, so deception is kind of a tricky topic, because sometimes it is something that goes on and it is allowed under a couple conditions. One is that alternatives are not available and participants are debriefed. So there might be studies where just like the Milgram study that we'll talk about in a bit, where you kind of have no choice but to deceive participants. If they, if they know exactly what's going on or you told them the truth, that would completely ruin the study. Well, that might be a case where you need to deceive them in some way. So again, as in our Milgram study that we'll look at next, you kind of have to deceive people there, as you'll see. But a couple things that have to be done is that, again, there are no alternatives available. So it's not like you can't just deceive people just for the heck of it. You obviously have to have no other feasible way of running the study. And then another one is that participants are debriefed. So at the end of the study, like I think we mentioned before, they should be told exactly what the true purpose of the study was if you deceive them. It can be active or passive. So you can either, again, depending on what's allowable or if there's no alternative, like actively tell them something is true that you know is not true, or just passively kind of let them come to their own conclusions. Active deception tends to be a more rigorous review, as you expect. But passive is just like if you don't tell them, but you don't actually actively misinform them. So obviously, deception could leave the participants feeling duped and experience a loss of self-esteem. Um, it can also get tricky because if they didn't give informed consent, maybe they wouldn't. They didn't really give informed consent, and maybe they wouldn't have if they had known, what's actually going on in the study. And they may also be suspicious of future research. So again, with all these things in mind, that's where we need to basically what you do is you do tell them there's deception, but you don't tell them what the deception is. So usually on the consent form, you'll say this study does involve deception, but you're not going to tell them what that deception might be. But you will, or sorry, you will later. When you debrief them, then you tell them exactly what the deception was. Right? Just also on the subject of debriefing, so they're more fully explain the purpose of the research, what purpose is, and give a complete description and justification for the deception. Okay. Stop there.